In the west of Ireland, where the heather stretches across low hills, and the boglands breathe damp mist on cold days, the old roads remember more than people would like to believe. The wind carries the scent of wet earth and peat, and in autumn the rain can fall for days and nights, as if the sky has forgotten that such a thing as sunlight exists. In places like these, stories have long been told. Some are no more than tales shared by the fire, while others are spoken more quietly, almost in whispers, as if people are unsure whether they should be spoken aloud at all. One such story speaks of a wanderer, whom the old people call Fear and Ghorta, the man of hunger. He appears on the roads on cold, rainy evenings, never in the middle of the day, never when many people are around. He is most often seen where the road cuts through heather, past boglands, or across old fields where the earth still remembers years of hardship and hunger. Those who claim to have seen him always describe him in much the same way. A gaunt man in an old coat, soaked through with rain. His face is pale and worn, as if he has walked a very long road, and his eyes seem to have seen more than any one man should. He usually stands by the roadside and waits. He does not stop people by force. He does not call out. He does not try to stir pity. He simply stands, and when someone passes, he asks for only one thing: a piece of bread, not money, not shelter, only food. Those who know the old legend say this is no ordinary meeting with a beggar. They say that Fear and Ghorta appears only to those he chooses to test, and that everything depends on what a person does when they stand face to face with him. Sometimes all it takes is a small gesture, a crust of bread taken from one's pocket and given to someone who seems hungrier than oneself. Long ago, when Ireland suffered through the years of the Great Hunger, people believed that Fear and Ghorta was the spirit of those who had died on the roads or in the fields before they could find help. Others said he was something more, a wanderer from another world, who appears from time to time to remind people of the simplest and most difficult truth of all: that one person should share their bread with another. And yet, in the small villages of Western Ireland, there are still those who claim that this legend does not belong only to the past. They say that sometimes, when the autumn rain lashes across the heather and the road through the bog falls silent before night comes, a solitary figure can be seen standing at its edge, as if waiting, as if still wishing to know whether people remember the old lesson. One such road runs near a small village called Fenagh. Fenagh was one of those scattered villages in the hills of County Leitrim, where boglands stretched to the horizon, and old stone walls divided wet ground from fields. The old roads there remembered a time when people walked more often than they drove. And it was along that road every day after work that a young man named Ciaran Doyle made his way home. Ciaran was one of those young men whose life does not begin with great hopes or promises, but with work and a silence one slowly grows used to, day by day. He lived on the edge of Fenagh, in an old stone cottage standing slightly apart from the rest of the village. The house had once belonged to his family, and remembered a time when more people lived there, and the fields were tended with greater care. The stone walls still held warmth on cold evenings, though the roof had long needed repair, and the windows creaked with every stronger gust of wind from the bog. Behind the house lay a small patch of land and an old orchard. A few apple trees and a single pear tree had stood there for years, as if more out of habit than strength. The older villagers still remembered when those trees bore enough fruit to sell some at the market in town. Now, their branches rarely bent under the weight of apples or pears, and many said the orchard had long since died. Ciaran, however, had no time to think about such things. His days began early. Before daylight fully reached the heather, he would leave the house and walk to the bus stop on the main road. From there, the bus carried him to a town several kilometers away. He worked in a warehouse for a large shop, where most of his day was spent lifting crates, stacking goods, and doing the kind of work others preferred to avoid. It was not the sort of job one spoke about with pride over a pint, but despite its weight, it gave him something important, a steady rhythm and a few reliable euros at the end of each week. After years in a home where peace had been a rare visitor, such ordinary work felt like something not to be taken for granted. The road back was always the same. The bus would leave him at the crossroads, and from there he still had over a kilometer to walk through fields and bogland before reaching the outskirts of Fenagh. It was a road he knew well. He knew where the ground sank more deeply after rain, where thick grass grew by the ditches, and where the heather turned its darkest shade of purple toward evening. He also knew the places where water gathered after heavy rain, forming puddles that passing cars would splash across the road without warning. The people of Fenagh often said that this road was older than the village itself. Some even claimed it ran through land that still remembered the years of hunger and hardship. Others laughed at such talk, saying people were too quick to believe stories told by the fire on long, wet evenings. Ciaran did not think much about it. His life, even at his young age, already held enough to occupy his thoughts. His mother had died a few years earlier, when he was still in school. Illness had taken her strength faster than anyone in the village had expected. She had been the one who kept the house together, who paid the bills, and reminded his father that life rarely allowed a man to take the easy road. After she was gone, things slowly began to fall apart. His father first began to drink more than before. Then he returned home less and less often, and one day he simply disappeared. Some in Fenagh said he had gone to England for work. Others claimed he had become involved in matters that led him to prison. Rumors travel quickly in small villages, but the truth is rarely among them. Ciaran stopped asking, just as he stopped waiting. He remained in the old house alone and learned to live as best he could, working, keeping quiet, and expecting little from life. That evening, as he walked the road through the bog, the autumn wind blew harder than usual. Rain fell in fine, cold needles, driven almost sideways across the fields. The road was nearly empty. The wind tugged at the wet grass along the edges, and rain tapped in thin streams against the stones and uneven ground. Ciaran walked with his head lowered, feeling the dampness slowly seep through his jacket and shirt, chilling the back of his neck. There was nothing unusual in that. Autumn in Leitrim rarely spared those who had to walk home. After a few minutes, the wind rose again. Where the road bent slightly between low stone walls, a shape appeared in the distance. For a moment, Ciaran could not tell whether it was only a shadow cast by the heather and rain, or a person standing by the road. The figure stood motionless, as if someone had stopped there and was watching the road. But who would choose to wander across fields and bogland at such an hour, and in such weather? Ciaran narrowed his eyes, trying to see more through the rain and fading light. But when he blinked and looked again, the figure was gone, vanished so suddenly that for a moment he thought he must have imagined it. Perhaps it had only been a bush or part of a wall, distorted by rain and shadow. He did not dwell on it. At that very moment, something moved sharply in the tall grass on the other side of the road. Ciaran stopped. From the heather, a dog burst out onto the road. It was soaked to the bone, moving unevenly as if trying to escape the wind, or something unseen behind it. Its fur clung to its body, and its tail was pressed low. For a moment, it stopped in the middle of the road, uncertain which way to go. Ciaran watched it, wondering whether it belonged to one of the farms in Fenagh, or if it was one of those wandering strays that appeared from time to time and vanished just as quickly. He was about to step toward it when he heard the distant sound of an engine. Then louder. Headlights appeared from around the bend, cutting through the dimness with a cold, white glare. The beams swept across the wet road and caught the dogs standing in their path. Ciaran felt something tighten in his stomach. "Hey," he muttered, stepping forward as if his voice alone could make the animal move. The dog did not react at once. It stood there frozen, blinded by the light, its wet fur shining like dark glass. The car was coming fast. Ciaran raised his hand, trying to signal the driver. "Hey!" he shouted, louder this time, but his voice was swallowed by the wind. At that same moment, the dog moved. Not aside, forward. There was a dull, heavy thud. The car braked sharply, tires screeching against the wet ground, water spraying out in all directions. Then, for a moment, silence. Only the wind still moved through the heather. Ciaran ran forward. The dog lay at the side of the road, moving weakly, trying to lift its head from the soaked ground. Its breathing was quick and shallow, its legs trembling from cold and pain. "Easy, easy," Ciaran said quietly, kneeling beside it. He reached out slowly, carefully, the way one does with a frightened animal. The dog looked at him with dark eyes, as if trying to understand whether the man beside it was danger or help. Then the car door opened. Light spilled out onto the wet road. A moment later, a woman stepped out. For a second, she stood by the open door, as if unsure what had just happened. Rain immediately began to settle on her light-colored coat, and the wind tugged at her hair. It was Fiona Harrington. In Fenagh, everyone knew her, though few could say they truly liked her. She had moved to the village a few years earlier, settling in one of the newer houses built at the edge of the fields. People said she worked in the city, that she had more money than most in that part of Leitrim had ever seen. The car she drove alone made that clear. Fiona often said that Fenagh was simply a quiet place to live. away from the noise of the city. But she kept her distance. In the shop she spoke briefly. In the pub she rarely stayed long. And when she did, she sat alone, as if everything around her was of little interest. The people of Fenagh knew one thing. Fiona Harrington preferred not to be involved in other people's problems. Rain streamed down her coat as she stepped closer and looked at the dog lying by the roadside. There was no concern on her face, only irritation. "It's not my dog," she said coldly. "It ran straight into the road. That's not my fault." Ciaran remained kneeling, trying to steady the animal's breathing. "It's hurt," he replied calmly. "You're not going to just leave it here, are you?" She shrugged. Someone should have been watching their dog, and if it doesn't have an owner... She paused briefly. "Then it's not my problem." Her tone made it clear the matter was already settled. "Besides," she added, glancing at it with visible distaste, "just look at it. Some filthy mongrel, probably full of fleas." Rain ran in thin lines down her coat as she cast another glance toward her car, clearly more concerned with the time she was losing than the animal at her feet. And in truth, that was exactly the case. "Listen," she said after a moment, her voice edged with impatience. "I'm in a hurry." Ciaran looked up. "I'll take it," he said. "I'll carry it back to the village. Maybe someone there will know what to do, or know someone who can help." He hesitated. "Could you give me a lift to Fenagh? It's not far." The woman looked at him as though she had only just noticed his soaked clothes and the dog lying in the mud. "Absolutely not." The answer came without hesitation. "I'm not ruining my car interior. That dog is filthy and wet, and honestly..." She made a faint face. "It's quite disgusting. And you're drenched. Sorry, but this isn't my concern." She turned back toward the car. Ciaran said nothing. He slid his arms carefully beneath the dog and tried to lift it. At that very moment, something moved at the edge of the bog. He froze. There, where the road faded into shadow, stood a figure, a dark silhouette of a man barely visible through the rain, standing perfectly still, as if watching everything. For a brief moment, Ciaran felt a strange certainty that it was the same figure he had seen earlier at the crossroads. Before he could look more closely, Fiona slammed the car door. The engine roared to life, headlights cut through the rain once more, and the car pulled away, disappearing around the bend. When the light faded, the road fell back into dimness. Ciaran looked again toward the bog. The figure was gone. Ciaran looked for a moment longer toward the boglands, as if expecting the figure to appear again. But the road was empty. Only the wind moved through the heather, and the rain fell in a steady, quiet rhythm onto the ground and stones. After a moment, he lowered his gaze. The dog lay motionless, breathing heavily, but when Ciaran once again placed his hand on its wet fur, the animal moved slightly and lifted its head. Their eyes met for a brief moment. There was no fear in them, rather something difficult to name. as if the animal understood that the man kneeling before it in the rain would not leave without it. "All right," Ciaran said quietly, more to himself than to the dog. "I won't leave you here." The dog whimpered softly, but did not try to pull away. It was heavier than it seemed, and its wet fur made it difficult to get a firm grip. Still, Ciaran lifted it slowly and pulled it closer, trying not to cause it any more pain. The rain immediately soaked into his clothes even more. For a moment he stood motionless in the middle of the road, as if listening, or perhaps wondering what to do next. Around him there was only what he had always known: wind, moorlands, and the empty road leading toward Fenagh. He began to walk forward slowly. Each step was now heavier, but he did not slow down. He knew he had to reach the village before full darkness fell. Maybe someone would know what to do. Maybe there would be someone who could help. The dog shifted slightly in his arms. After a moment, its head dropped onto Ciaran's shoulder, as if seeking support. And the road through the moorlands, which until now had been only a part of everyday life, was beginning to lead him towards something he did not yet understand. Ciaran walked slowly, carefully placing his steps on the wet ground. The dog rested in his arms motionless, only occasionally moving slightly, as if trying to find a more comfortable position. The lights of the first houses appeared in the distance only after some time. Fenagh at that hour was slowly falling into silence. Most people were already inside their homes, and the only sign of life were the warm lights in the windows and thin trails of smoke rising above the roofs. The boy passed his own house without stopping even for a moment. He turned onto a narrower road, leading toward an old farm standing somewhat on the outskirts of the village. The house belonged to Bridget O'Shea, a woman people came to when they no longer knew what to do. But before he reached the stone wall surrounding her farm, he stopped for a moment. He did not know why. Maybe it was just exhaustion, or maybe something else made him look back. He turned slowly. The road he had come from disappeared into the half-dark. The rain was still falling, and the wind moved the wet clumps of grass, as if something invisible was moving among them. And then he saw it again. Far away at the edge of visibility, where the road vanished between the fields, the outline of a figure flickered. It stood motionless, just like the previous time. It did not move, did not come closer, did not leave, as if it were only watching. For a brief moment, Ciaran had the impression that the gaze of that figure was directed exactly at him and at the dog he held in his arms. Rain ran down his face, and his heart beat faster than a moment before. He blinked. When he looked again, the figure was already only a fading shadow among the moorlands. Or it had not been there at all. Ciaran turned away without a word and continued on. He did not look back again. A moment later he was already standing at Bridget's door. He knocked. The door opened after a moment. An older woman stood in the doorway wrapped in a thick woolen shawl. Her face was lined with fine wrinkles, but her gaze was attentive and calm, the kind that seemed to see more than it spoke. This was Bridget O'Shea. In Fenagh, people said she understood things that remained a mystery to others. but she herself rarely spoke of it. Her gaze rested first on Ciaran, then on the dog in his arms. "Come in," she said briefly, stepping away from the door. Inside it was pleasantly warm. The smell of peat and dried herbs filled the air, and the fire in the fireplace cast a soft light on the walls and old wooden furniture. The rain ceased to matter once the door closed behind the boy. "Lay him here," Bridget added, pointing to a place by the fireplace where an old thick blanket lay. Ciaran knelt and carefully laid the dog down. The animal moved slightly but did not try to get up. The woman stepped closer without hesitation. Her movements were sure and calm, as if she had done this hundreds of times before. She crouched and began checking the dog's paws and sighed. "Doesn't look too bad," she muttered after a moment. "He's battered, but nothing is broken, at least at first glance." The dog flinched when she touched its side, but quickly calmed under her hand. "I'll bring something to clean it," she added, standing up. Ciaran stood still for a moment, suddenly feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over him as soon as he was in the warmth. "Sit down," Bridget said, disappearing for a moment into the other room. "And take off those wet clothes, or you'll catch a cold." When she returned, she handed him a towel and a thick woolen sweater. "My brother left it here once," she added, as if that explained everything. Ciaran nodded. "Thank you." A moment later, he was sitting closer to the fire, feeling the warmth slowly return to his frozen hands. Bridget took care of the dog. She cleaned the mud from its fur, washed the wounds, and covered it with a blanket. The animal laid its head on the material and sighed softly, as if for the first time in a long while it had found peace. "Leave him here for the night," she finally said. "He'll be better off here than with you, and you have to go to work in the morning anyway." Ciaran looked at the dog. "I'll come for him tomorrow," he said. "You will," Bridget nodded calmly, "and then we'll see what comes next." For a moment, silence fell. The fire crackled softly in the fireplace. "I saw something on the way," the boy said at last, uncertainly. "There, by the moorlands." As if someone was standing by the road, first at the fork, then farther on. Maybe some stranger is wandering around the area. Or, I don't even know. He hesitated. Or maybe I just imagined it. The woman did not answer immediately. She stood for a moment by the dog, looking at it carefully. Then she shifted her gaze to Ciaran. Her face remained calm, but something difficult to grasp appeared in her eyes. Roads through bogs or moorlands like to play tricks on people, she finally said quietly. Especially in autumn. That was her entire answer, but the way she first looked at the dog and then at him made Ciaran no longer certain whether it was really just fatigue and rain. Morning came faster than Ciaran would have liked. The night passed quietly, though the fatigue from the previous day still clung to his body. Still, he got up early, before the light fully spread over the fields. The road was the same as every day, wind, fields, and stone walls. Everything looked as if nothing from the previous evening had happened. Work passed slowly. He carried out his duties without haste, unloading goods and moving crates, just as he did every day. But his thoughts kept returning from time to time to the dog left with Bridget and to what he had seen on the road the previous evening. Toward the end of his shift, he stopped by the shop. With his last coins, he bought a can of dog food and a cheap sandwich that was to serve as his evening meal. Instead of going home afterward, he headed toward Bridget's farm. When he knocked, the door opened almost immediately. "Come in," she said calmly. The dog lay by the fireplace, wrapped in a blanket. At the sight of Ciaran, it lifted its head and then, to his surprise, tried to get up. It took a few unsteady steps, limping slightly but clearly wanting to come closer. "Well now," the woman murmured, "there's more strength in him than it seemed." The dog came up to the boy and stopped beside him, wagging its tail slightly, as if it had been waiting for him. "Nothing serious," Bridget added. "A few superficial wounds, a bit battered. He'll rest and he'll be fine." Ciaran knelt and stroked the dog's head. "I'll take him with me," he said. Bridget nodded, but her gaze became more attentive for a moment. "You can," she replied calmly. "Just be careful, Ciaran." She hesitated for a moment, as if she wanted to say something more. Not everything that comes to a person happens without a reason. Ciaran looked at her, but she had already turned her gaze toward the fire. He thanked her briefly. Then he took the dog and slowly headed toward his home on the edge of Fenagh, not yet knowing that what had happened the previous evening was only the beginning. The evening was cold and damp, though the rain had stopped for a while. In front of the shop, in the center of the village, a few people had gathered, as was usually the case at that time of day. Someone was talking by the entrance, someone else was adjusting a shopping bag, and the door kept opening and closing, letting in gusts of cold air. Fiona Harrington stood slightly to the side by her car. She held a phone in her hand and was speaking quickly, with clear impatience, as if the conversation were just another task to be checked off. Her voice, though lowered, carried a sharpness that could not be mistaken for politeness. When she finished, she sighed softly and put the phone into her handbag. And then she saw him. He stood a few steps away. He had appeared so quietly that no one had noticed him. A gaunt man in an old coat, too thin for this time of year, and too soaked to provide any warmth. He stood calmly, his hands hanging at his sides, as if he did not want to take up more space than necessary. He did not step closer. He did not reach out his hand. He simply waited. "Could you help me?" he asked. Fiona looked at him with clear surprise, as if for a moment she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. "I'm listening." The man did not change his position. "Just a piece of bread, please," he said calmly. "Not much." For a moment, silence fell between them. One of the women standing by the shop entrance glanced in their direction, then quickly looked away. Fiona raised her eyebrows slightly. This must be a joke. There wasn't a trace of compassion in her voice. "Do you really think that's how it works?" The man did not respond. He looked at her calmly, without pressure, without expectation. "People work to have something," Fiona continued, her voice growing sharper. "Maybe you should try that too. Instead of bothering strangers outside a shop." The rain started again. Quietly but distinctly, drops tapped against the asphalt and the car roof, and the wind stirred the heather somewhere beyond the village. The man did not step back. "Just a little food," he repeated. Fiona shook her head in disbelief. "No, this is not a place for begging. Go somewhere else, or find yourself a job instead of relying on other people's kindness." Her words hung in the air, heavy and cold. At that very moment her gaze shifted past the man's shoulder. Ciaran was approaching from the direction of the houses. The dog stayed close to him, more confident than the day before, though still stepping carefully. Its fur was clean and dry, and its eyes attentive. Fiona grimaced slightly. "Well, well," she said with a hint of disdain. "I see. You decided to keep that dog after all." Her gaze moved over the animal. "I hope you didn't bring all its fleas into the village." Ciaran did not respond. His attention was fixed on the man. He stood exactly as before, calm, motionless, as if time around him flowed differently. The man slowly turned his head and looked at Ciaran. Their eyes met for a brief moment. And although not a single word was spoken, the boy had the feeling that something had just been said between them. For a short while no one moved. Then the dog took the first step. It moved away from Ciaran and walked straight toward the man standing in front of Fiona. It stopped right beside him, lifted its head, and looked at him carefully for a moment. And then it wagged its tail, at first uncertainly, then more clearly, as if greeting an old acquaintance. Ciaran frowned slightly. The man did not step back. He did not reach out. He did not touch the dog. He only inclined his head slightly, as if listening to something others could not hear. And then he spoke softly, so softly that the words seemed more like a whisper than a voice. "A good choice, my friend." The dog shifted restlessly, as if that was exactly what it needed. Fiona snorted with contempt. "Well, well," she said, crossing her arms, "a flea-ridden man recognizes another." No one answered her. The rain began to fall harder, as if it wanted to drown out something that did not belong in this place. The man lifted his gaze. He looked straight at Ciaran. "Do you have something to eat?" he asked calmly. "A piece of bread will do." There was no pleading in his voice, only a request. Without hesitation, Ciaran reached into his backpack, took out the sandwich he had bought after work, and handed it to the man. "Here." The man looked at him and took the sandwich slowly. "Thank you," he said, almost in a whisper. There was no smile on his face, but something in his gaze changed for a brief moment, as if he was remembering the gesture. Fiona shook her head in disbelief. "Really?" she said, turning toward the car. "You're giving your food to the first random drifter." She paused for a moment by the door. "Stupidity remains stupidity," she added coldly. "And one day it will cost you." She got into the car and slammed the door. The engine growled, and a moment later the car drove off, leaving behind the wet road and the soft sound of tires on asphalt. When the lights disappeared around the bend, Fenagh became quiet again. Ciaran looked toward the man, but he was already walking away, slowly, without hurry, as if nothing had happened. The boy kept looking for a moment at the place where he had just seen him. The man's figure gradually faded between the houses, the rain blurring his outline with each step. Ciaran turned briefly, glancing at the dog standing beside him. The animal was looking in the same direction, calm, as if it knew more than it should. When he looked up again, the road was empty. No one was there. Not a trace of the man who had been standing just a few steps away. As if he had dissolved into the rain and the grey air over Fenagh. The boy frowned but said nothing. After a moment he headed toward his home, and the dog slowly followed him. The next day after work, when he returned home and greeted his new companion, he decided to visit Bridget's farm. The road was quiet. The wind had almost died down, and a heavy, damp silence hung over the village, as if Fenagh had paused for a breath. When he reached Bridget's house, he knocked without hesitation. The door opened after a moment. "You've come back?" she said calmly, letting him inside. The interior was warm, and the fire in the fireplace burned just as it had the evening before. Ciaran took off his jacket and stepped closer to the fire. The warmth quickly began to spread through his hands and feet, and the exhaustion of the whole day's work suddenly settled over him. Only now could he allow himself to feel it. "He's doing well," he said after a moment, glancing at the dog lying by the fireplace, gently wagging its tail. "I can see that," Bridget replied calmly. "There's more strength in him than it seems." Ciaran knelt beside him and stroked his head. The animal moved closer, resting its muzzle against his hand. For a moment, silence filled the room. The fire crackled softly, and the wind outside was barely audible. "Yesterday," Ciaran finally said, "I met that man by the shop." Bridget did not look at him immediately. "The same one," he added. After a moment she raised her eyes. "He asked for food," the boy continued. "I gave him a sandwich, and then it was as if he disappeared into the evening darkness." Bridget was silent for a moment. She looked at the dog as if Ciaran's words were not the most important thing, but rather what lay beside the fireplace. "Long ago," she finally said quietly, "people used to tell stories about meetings like this." The young man smiled slightly with a hint of disbelief. "Like what?" Bridget adjusted the shawl on her shoulders. "About a man who appears on roads and near bridges," she replied calmly. "He does not ask for much, only for a piece of bread." For a moment, silence fell. "They used to say he does not come to everyone," she added, "and that he is not always who he seems to be." Ciaran shook his head. "It's just a wanderer," he said. "Nothing more." Bridget looked at him carefully. Then she shifted her gaze to the dog. "Perhaps," she answered quietly. And she said nothing more. Several months passed. Winter came and went as it always did, giving way to spring and then to summer, which that year was warmer and calmer than usual. In Ciaran's house there was no longer the same silence as before. The dog stayed and became the young man's faithful companion. With time, the people in the village grew fond of him as well. He was given a name, a place by the fireplace, and always something to eat. He quickly grew used to the house, as if he had known from the very beginning that this was exactly where he was meant to be. He stayed close to Ciaran, but he was never demanding. Rather present, calmly, steadily, like someone who had simply become part of everyday life. With time, something else began to change. At work, the young man started to be noticed. At first it was small things. Someone praised him, someone asked for help, someone trusted him more than before. Then came an offer he had never expected. He was made the manager of the warehouse. Not because he had tried to become one, but because for a long time he had simply done his work as well as he could. And as it turned out, someone had finally noticed. Work became calmer, more orderly. The hours were shorter and the pay higher. For the first time in a long while, Ciaran no longer had to count every day from morning to evening. But the greatest change came from another direction. Behind the house, where an old orchard had stood forgotten for years, something happened that no one in Fenagh expected. The trees blossomed, at first timidly, as if they themselves were unsure whether they could still do it. And then summer came, and the branches bent under the weight of fruit. Apples and pears appeared in quantities no one could remember seeing for many years. For the first few days, Ciaran looked at it in disbelief. Then he began to gather them. Some he took to the nearby market. People were happy to buy fresh fruit. The rest he gave to the neighbors, who accepted them with smiles and a little surprise. "It hasn't been like this for a long time," they said. Ciaran only nodded. As for Fiona, not much was said. Only what people in the village managed to pass on to one another, by the shop, along the road, in short conversations. Apparently, things at work had not turned out the way they should have. She either left or was dismissed. No one knew exactly. Later people said she sold her house and left Fenagh, returning to her parents somewhere farther away. No one knew the details, and no one particularly asked about them. In small places, such stories appear and disappear just as quickly as they begin. Ciaran sometimes heard about it in passing. He never commented. Life went on. It changed slowly, but noticeably. First work, then calmer days, and then something else. something difficult to name, but present in every ordinary moment. There was simply more of something, as if the world around him had become a little gentler. With time, there was even an old small car which shortened the road across the heather and made everyday life just a little easier. And then came things even simpler, quieter, time that had once been missing, conversations that were not necessary, someone's presence that demanded nothing, and yet was there. In the evenings, Ciaran would sit in front of the house. The dog lay beside him, calm as always, with his head resting on the ground and his eyes half closed, as if keeping watch even while resting. At such moments, Fenagh was quiet. The wind carried the scent of the heather, and somewhere far away a few faint sounds of life could be heard. And it was exactly then, sometimes, that he remembered that day. The man who had asked him only for a piece of bread. He never saw him again. But from that day on, he had the feeling that something in his life had changed for the better, as if the road he walked every day back home now led him somewhere different than before, quieter, calmer, better. And in this part of Leitrim, people sometimes say that on the heaths and the boglands one may meet a man who asks only for a piece of bread, and that from this one small gesture more may depend than a person is able to understand.